Hello and welcome to the video podcast for Monitor a Safe Workplace. In this podcast, we'll be having a look specifically at the legislation and acts that go towards making up health and safety regulations throughout Australia. To begin, we need to know what is health and safety. Well, occupational health and safety is an area concerned with protecting the safety, health and welfare of people engaged in work or employment. The goals of an occupational safety and health programs include to foster a safe, healthy work environment, and OHS is also there to protect co-workers, family members, employers, customers, and many others who may be affected by the workplace environment. Occupational safety and health can be important for moral, legal, and financial reasons. All organisations have a duty of care to ensure that employers, employees, and any other person who may be affected by the company's undertakings remain safe at all times. Now, some common examples of occupational health and safety hazards are pictured on the screen here. So the first box we can see a musculoskeletal injury happening, which is a back injury due to poor manual handling technique. In the second, we see someone about to take a knock on the head through poor placement of tools and poor storage. In the third, we can see someone coming into contact with a mechanical device which has caused them a bit of a mischief. And in the final, we can see a chemical spill or hazardous waste that is causing an issue for that particular employee. Now, occupational health and safety hazards will range depending on the type of industry in which you're engaged. That's not to say that you're immune from any of these injuries in any workplace, but depending on the type of industry in which you work, the prevalence of injuries will vary from sector to sector. In the second podcast, we'll be having a look at the specific hazards and how to identify them and what measures you need to put into place to control those hazards. So this podcast is going to give you a bit of background into the legislation and what goes towards making up the health and safety laws around Australia. So the health and safety laws are introduced via legislation. Now, legislation includes acts, regulations, Australian standards, and codes of practice. Let's have a look at a little bit more detail at these. An Act is a statement of the law made by federal or state parliament and covers for a particular topic, for example, occupational health and safety. Now you can see from the map of Australia on the screen, each state and each territory has its own Occupational Health and Safety Act. And with those acts, you can see that they were introduced at different points throughout the last couple of decades. This generally happens either due to a change of federal legislation or a new industry opening up, or perhaps an incident which has forced the government of the day to go back and have a look at the various incidents and the various strengths of their own legislation. The second part to occupational health and safety legislation is regulations. Now, a regulation supports the general requirement of the legislation, or of the Act, and provides more detail. So again, you can see from the map of Australia, each state and territory again has different regulations that govern their Act. Again, this is down to the reasons that I described on the last slide. It does vary from state to state, and as they get updated, these old regulations get superseded. And these two, the acts and the regulations, are supported by codes of practice. Now, industry codes of practice and guidelines provide practical guidance and advice on how to achieve the standard required by the Act and the regulation. And these codes of practice provide duty holders with guidance on effective ways to manage work, health, and safety risks. How these codes of practice are approved is by the minister responsible for work health and safety legislation in each jurisdiction. So this will either be the state minister or perhaps a local government minister as well. So the responsible minister can approve, vary or revoke codes of practice that have been developed in accordance with the model of the Work Health Safety Act. For a code of practice to be approved, varied or revoked, it needs to be developed through a consultation between three different stakeholders, which is the Commonwealth, state and territory governments, unions, or any employee organisations as well. And the approval, variation or revocation of a code of practice must be published in a government gazette before it takes effect. So essentially, industry needs to be informed of any changes to codes of practice so that they can introduce and update and train their workforce accordingly. The code of practice also gives some legal clout to workplace health and safety officers. And codes of practice are admissible in court proceedings under the Occupational Health and Safety Act and regulations. Courts can regard codes of practice as evidence of what is known about a hazard, risk, or control, and can sometimes rely on the code of practice in determining what is reasonably practicable in the circumstances to which the code of practice relates. In the second podcast in health and safety, we'll be having a look at identifying hazards and risks, as well as risk assessment. And certainly when we are risk assessing, it's very important to know what is practicable, what is reasonable and practicable. I hope this introduction has given you a good overview of the background to health and safety laws. It's important that you do look up the individual health and safety laws and acts for your state, as they do vary slightly. There is plenty of information available online, and in Moodle you'll find some more pointers which will guide you in the right direction. If you have any further questions about the Act or about the legislation or the regulations or code of practice, feel free to use the forums to contact your fellow participants. Also, your trainer is available through the agreed means. I hope you found this enjoyable and informative, and until next time, keep learning.